Good morning, everyone. Je m'appelle Stephen Toup, président de la Fédération des sciences humaines, et je suis ravi de vous voir en si grand nombre aujourd'hui, though I am not surprised because it's Cindy Blackstock. She's worth hearing, there's no question. The Federation is the national voice for Canada's 90,000 researchers in the humanities and social sciences. Our membership comprises over 160 universities and scholarly associations across this great country. We'd like to acknowledge and give thanks for being on unceded Algonquin territory this morning. The Federation's Big Thinking on the Hill series helps bring research to parliamentarians, we hope, to inform public policy. Je souhaite remercier l'honorable Greg Fergus, notre député parrain de la série. C'est grâce à M. Fergus que ces événements peuvent se tenir dans ce magnifique restaurant du Parlement. I also want to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for their continuing support for this series. Si vous avez besoin de traduction simultanée, les détails se trouvent sur vos tables. Nous avons aussi des écouteurs à l'inscription, à l'extérieur. The momentum for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada is, I think, growing, building in large part on the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. But what does meaningful reconciliation look like? The current government has promised to renew the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. However, an understanding of the historical relationship between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples is essential to confronting the challenges of reconciliation that still remain. You cannot make progress without acknowledging the real failures of the past. We at the Federation are thrilled to have Cindy Blackstock as a board member of the Federation, and I'm personally delighted to welcome her today and looking forward to hearing her thoughts on the important issue of equality and fairness for First Nations children. J'invite maintenant Brent Herbert Copley, vice-président directeur du Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines, de présenter notre conférencière. Brent. Thank you, everyone.
Well, good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Amasa. And thank you, Stephen. I thought perhaps that we should take a moment to begin this by congratulating Stephen, in fact, on his historic nomination as Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University. But to the point of this morning's presentation, on behalf of SSHRC, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, our president, Ted Hewitt, I want to say how pleased I am to be here this morning. I know Ted would join me in recognizing the really critical role that this series, the Big Thinking Lectures on the Hill, play in bringing important, topical, high-quality research to our nation's policymakers and leaders. And given SSHRC's history of support to research by and with Indigenous people, it's a particular pleasure to have the chance to introduce our speaker this morning. As a country, and as Stephen has indicated, we find ourselves in the midst of what really is a tremendous opportunity, an opportunity to restore relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. C'est une question de droit de la personne, de décence, de respect, mais c'est aussi une question de grands avantages sociaux, économiques et politiques pour nous tous et toutes. En tant que pays, nous avons beaucoup de nous réjouir, mais autant plus si nous pouvons saisir cette occasion de réconciliation, de faire bien les choses. Donc, faire bien les choses, getting things right, is really what our speaker, Cindy Blackstock, is all about. In her clear-spoken, in her high-energy, and of course very determined way, she's an accomplished expert in holding our collective feet to the fire. She speaks for those whose voices aren't heard, or at least aren't heard loudly enough, for Indigenous children who should be able to count on the things that all of us take for granted. Sufficient resources to grow, to develop our talents, to be healthy, to contribute to our families, our communities, and our country. Donc, au nom de tous, je tiens à remercier Cindy pour ce qu'elle a dit souvent et avec tant de force. Nous t'écoutons, Cindy, nous t'entendons et nous accordons de la valeur à ton leadership et ta vision. A member of the Gitxsan First Nation, Cindy's executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, based here in Ottawa. She holds degrees from top universities across the country, from UBC, McGill, Toronto, and has had academic positions at many more. Most recently, she's been named professor in the School of Social Work at McGill University. A social worker for over 25 years, a professor, an activist, Cindy has brought crucial awareness of the inequities faced by Indigenous children. Her tireless advocacy bore particular fruit this past January when the Canadian Human Rights Commission ruled that successive federal governments have discriminated against Indigenous children by underfunding child welfare services. Donc, c'est vraiment un plaisir, mesdames et messieurs, de vous présenter notre conférencière ce matin, Cindy Blackstock. Cindy.
So, what a great honor to be here on unceded Algonquin territory, the year before Canada's 150th birthday. 150 years this country's existed. But for Indigenous people, these lands have always been here. And for the children, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children of today, their grandparents attended residential schools where there were no birthday parties, where there were no hugs, where there was an admonishment for who you were, for who your parents were. It seemed just right that to truly celebrate Canada's 150th birthday, that we set our relationship with this generation of First Nations children right. That would indeed be the best 150th birthday present we could give the country. Because we can't make the same mistake twice. And history tells us that we're in danger of doing that, and I argue that we are actually doing it. This is a film done by the renowned filmmaker Eleniso Bomsawin. For those of you who don't know her, she is 84 years old and much more eloquent and has much more energy than I do. She brought her cameras into the courtroom to witness history for those of you who could not be there. I'm going to share with you the trailer, and then I'm going to take us through a little bit of a history lesson of reconciliation, not from the perspective so much of the First Nation survivors of residential school, but from another perspective, the one that was acted out in this house of government. I am going to show you that we have always known better for First Nations children, that we always had the opportunity to do better for First Nations children, and we have consistently failed to treat them equally. But that knowledge can equip us for that birthday party next year when we set things right. So, without further ado, here is the trailer of We Cannot Make the Same Mistake Twice, premiered at TIFF and is touring at film festivals all over the country.
This case is about access to justice for some of the most vulnerable members of society, Aboriginal children living on reserve.
We had so many people wanting to come here and participate and learn from this that we had to put them in shifts. We've had children here as young as 6 who have sat attentively, respectfully, who have listened, who have learned, and who have formed their own opinions. And what gives me such great hope is when they grow up and they have families of their own, they will have a different place of information to make decisions about what they're going to tell their children about First Nations peoples and the country of Canada and our responsibility to care for one another.
It feels good because I know there's something wrong in the world and I want to fix it.
And the kids are going to win because you're here supporting them. So thank you to all of you for what you're doing. Very excited to meet all of you. Thank you. Well done.
The persecution of Indigenous children is not in Canada's rearview mirror. The residential school survivors shared their experience with all of us in the hopes that we would not allow their grandchildren and their grandchildren's children to undergo the injustices that they have so long endured. These are the children who are waiting to be treated equally. As a non-Aboriginal girl told me, she said, "Discrimination is when the government doesn't think you're worth the money." And I think you can all agree with me that every one of these children is worth the money. There's really no excuse to not treat First Nations children equitably in education and health and social services. And when people see me up in the media and they say she's passionate, well, this is the reason why. Is children's childhoods do not get put on hold in convenient budget cycles. They do not wait and do nothing with their childhood while governments and politicians and leaders figure out what to do. And let's face it, some people say, well, equality is complicated, but so is colonization, and we mastered that. Surely we can be better at treating children equally than we have in the past. And it's not just for First Nations people. Of course, those of you who know the work of Sir Michael Marmot, the great Sir Michael Marmot, and also of Wilkinson and Pickett, know that if you wanted to do something very important in Parliament, in fact, if I ran for Prime Minister, the one thing I would focus on is reducing the inequalities in our own society. Because as children like Raya knows, when you reduce inequalities in your society, you reduce the incarceration rates. You increase trust in communities. You make a more robust economy. You reduce teen pregnancy rates. All of these things happen from making a more equal society. Now, there are some in Canada who say, well, we're doing really well for our kids. We're actually devoting a lot of our effort in Parliament and a lot of our budgetary resources to children. But that does not survive a test of reality. And just think about it. How many times have we heard the word children in the House of Commons in the past week versus the word economy or the word moving expenses? Right? This is we are one of the richest countries in the world. And it's thanks to many of the resources that have been gifted to all of us by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples that we have this wealth. But when it comes to actually how we treat our children, there's an international index called the Kids' Rights Index. It rates countries as to how well they're doing for children proportionate to their wealth. And on that ranking, we are 72nd in the world. And when you look at the sub-index, it really measures the metric around what governments do, i.e., how much attention do governments give in their budgets and in their legislation to children, both at a federal and provincial and territorial level. We actually are 135th in the world. So why is it that our economy is doing multiple times better than our children are, when the economy is supposed to be about creating a better life for our children? Haven't we lost touch of the importance of why we actually want to have a robust economy in the first place? So there's much to be done to improve Canada's ranking. It'll come out this year, and I'm hoping for far better than 72nd, but I don't think it will be. Now let's take a little glimpse back in history. This is a document that was drafted here. It's a request. It's a letter from Duncan Campbell Scott, who was hired by John A. Macdonald at the age of 17 as a clerk. And he is writing to the Department of Justice for a warrant for the removal of First Nations children so they could be placed in residential schools. Two things to take note of here. One is that the removals were for the purposes of education, which we all know in this room was anything but education. But the second is that they were not properly cared for, that these parents were not capable of raising their own children. And what is so troubling about that is look at where we put the children. Clearly not an improvement from where they came from. But the system was blind to that question. We never asked if we had a better option to offer. We assumed in the colonial experience that we did. And we defended that perception against all incoming evidence. Even when the first chief medical health officer of Indian Affairs, one of my heroes, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, raised the alarm in 1907, saying that children are dying at the rate of 24% in these schools from preventable causes of disease. He delivered that report into this House. He thought that people would listen and they would do what was required to end it. The cost to saving the children's lives was $10,000 to $15,000. Even back then, it was a paltry bit of money. And as Bryce pointed out, they were spending more money for tuberculosis treatment just in the city of Ottawa than they were for First Nations people all over the country. But Duncan Campbell Scott said that was too expensive, that they wouldn't be able to afford it. They could do some things for Aboriginal people, but let's face it, they could only take a good first step. Change doesn't happen overnight, was his argument. And so the children died. Now, Bryce didn't leave it at there. He understood that democracy had two functions. One is those in government. But when government doesn't do the moral and just thing, it always lies with the people to rise up. And that's why his report is leaked to the Ottawa Citizen newspaper. As you can see, this is a copy of the Ottawa Citizen. It was called the Evening Citizen back in 1907. And it's on the front page, huh? And it was also on the front page of newspapers echoing all the way to the west coast to the Victoria Colonist. And the plea was for Canadians to rise up. My gosh, children are dying. We could do something about this. Let's do it. But Bryce screamed into silence. The Canadian public, the Canadian media, and unfortunately people in this House failed those children and they died unnecessarily. Bryce wasn't done. In 1922, for those of you who walk up Spark Street, this false front still here right beside the post office, walks into Parliament and publishes a national crime. And he circulates it to all members of the House. He figures if people knew about the problem, they had the solution to do it, they would act immediately to stop it. And nothing happened. Even though we had other remarkable Canadians speaking out, like Samuel Hume Blake, one of the co-founders of Blake's law firm, who wrote upon reading about Bryce's research that in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. So it's wrong to cloak ourselves with the belief that people of the period did not know any better. And it's important that we remind ourselves that we are the people of this period. So how are we reacting in proportion to the injustices happening today for these children? Are we acting any differently than the people did back there, either in the House or as citizens? Now, Dr. Bryce wasn't the only one raising the alarm. This is a letter written by a little boy in the Christmas season of 1923, a year after a national crime was published. It's written by a little boy named Edward B. Now, it's addressed, "Dear parent, we do not know if it ever got to his parent." But what he's writing about is how hungry he and the other boys are in the residential school. So hungry that they have to eat cats and wheat. And in the spirit of a little boy who doesn't know how to react any different to cruelness, he says, "I'm going to hit the teacher next time she's cruel to me." He doesn't know anything else to do but that, to protect himself and protect the other little boys. Now, this heartbreaking letter did end up somewhere. It ended up in the hands of Duncan Campbell Scott. Duncan Campbell Scott received this letter, and his response was that 99% of the children in residential schools are too fat anyway. And he would do nothing about it. Duncan Campbell Scott served 57 years in the public service, and upon his retirement, he was named one of the eminent Canadians. His name is still on that list by the Government of Canada. And he was also the president of the Royal Society. He was given honorary doctorate degrees. And he was, a reception was held by him by the Government of Canada to honor him for his loyal public service. But it's interesting that Scott himself, in writing a letter to a publisher, and we know this from the great historian John Malloy, who wrote the book A National Crime, which everyone in Canada should read because it tells the story of residential schools from the perspective of the Government of Canada's own documents. But what Scott said is I never did anything courageous in my entire life. I never did anything courageous in my entire life. When is it that we should all be insubordinate to bad ideas, like Bryce did? What is the price of blind loyalty? What is the price of normalizing racism? Well, we know that it cost the lives of at least 6,000 children, and yet that in and of itself was not enough to awaken the Canadian consciousness. If we fast forward in the history of residential schools, this is another document that I have. It's dated 1967. I would have been 3 years old when this document came out. And as you can see, it shows that the not properly cared for provision of residential schools was being used with reckless abandon. And so by 1967, 80% of the kids in residential schools were placed there for really what were child welfare reasons. Now this report was commissioned by the Department of Indian Affairs. And as you can see, their recommendation is that there needs to be more resources to keep the kids in their families. The Government of Canada's response is one of incremental equality. We have cross-cutting deep levels of inequality for First Nations kids. We're going to put a little bit of money on it. It's a good first step, but it's going to fall far short of what equality needs. The same recommendation echoes over the next 50 years without ever really being acted upon with enthusiasm. Now, it wasn't just in child welfare. This is a report on education that dated that same year. And this is by a guy named R. Alex Sims. Again, a report for Indian Affairs. It documents the need for Indian control over Indian education. It talks about the importance of threading Indigenous lessons throughout curriculum. It talks about the importance of ending the inequalities in First Nations education on reserves. It talks about teaching teachers about Indigenous history. I was 3 years old when this was written. I was one of those kids who could have benefited had the Government of Canada risen to the call of these reports and done the right thing for children. But it wasn't done. And these same recommendations are finding themselves a new currency today. And we hear people say, we want to make a good first step. Well, I'm not interested in first steps. I think we did the first steps 52 years ago. It's time to move to the last steps for children. This is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. It was done in 1996. This would be the 20th anniversary. Many of you know that the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples provided a pathway away from the Indian Act. We are the only Western industrial country in the world to have a race-based piece of legislation. So when we look down south, and some of us watched the debate last night and kind of shook our heads at one of the candidates on the question of race, we should also turn our eyes towards ourselves. Why wasn't the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples implemented? Why aren't we celebrating Canada's 150th birthday free of the Indian Act? It's because of our complacency. And that same report talks about Aboriginal agencies. See, we took over child welfare, but with a straitjacket. We had to use provincial legislation and federal funding that fell far short of what other Canadians received. And you can see here they're making the same call pretty much that was made by Caldwell in 1967. More resources, more support, and equity. In 2000, I was one of those people that arrived on the scene, as most academics do, and you hope that if you do research and you document the problem with government, you come up with evidence-based solutions that are economically costed out, and you present them that the government will do the right thing, especially for kids, right? Especially for kids. We're talking about little kids here. I think it's the way Bryce himself would have thought about it. And I think that's why he was so frustrated in his life, never having seen the government act on that. How is that possible? Well, we did those reports along with First Nations from across the country, the federal government, and experts, not once, but twice. The first report in 2000, the second in 2005. The one in 2000 pegged the shortfall at 22%. So First Nations children on reserve were getting 78 cents on the dollar for child welfare compared to non-Aboriginal kids. By 2005, that had grown to 30% less. The consequences, both agreed to by the federal government, is a lack of prevention services to help families recover from the multi-generational effects of residential school, is driving First Nations kids unnecessarily into child welfare care. We are replicating the same pattern as residential schools. And in fact, we're more efficient at it. There are 3 times more First Nations kids in child welfare today than at the height of residential schools. Now, it wasn't just First Nations. It wasn't just us, like Edward B., calling for reform. The Auditor General, both Sheila Fraser and Michael Ferguson, have presented many reports to this House, documenting the inequalities across a whole array of services, including child welfare, and seeing very little movement by the House to remedy what is racial discrimination as fiscal policy in the federal government. And those solutions exist on the books and need to be remedied if we actually want to be a country that stands for fairness and preaches and abides by human rights. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission made child welfare its top call to action. Why? Because we're losing another generation of kids to these inequalities and these injustices. So I welcome all members of Parliament who support the TRC's calls to action. They're absolutely essential. But supporting them is not enough. We need to translate those into effective change for children. This is one document that was presented at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And I think it shows the impact of really focusing on our fairness as adults, because sometimes it's tempting, especially when you're hearing that you've racially discriminated against 163,000 kids in 2016, to try to comfort yourself, because it's so scary, it's so hurtful. You want to focus on what you've done or what you're planning to do. But what we have here is a reminder of where we need to focus, which is not on ourselves as adults, but on the children. One of the documents Indian Affairs produced as evidence at the tribunal talked about the overrepresentation of First Nations children in child welfare care. And I can present you the stats from studies. I can say they're 12 times more likely to be in foster care due to poverty, poor housing, and caregiver substance misuse. I can tell you that half of the children in care are Aboriginal in this country today. But to really understand it, you need to think about the way children themselves think about it, which is, how many sleeps do I see my mom? This document added up the number of nights First Nations children on reserve only and in the Yukon spent in foster care between 2008, or between 1996 and 2012. The number of people in this picture is 1 million. The number of nights those children spent away from their moms and dads, 66 million nights, or 187,000 years of childhood. Every day that we put this off, that number grows by about 9,500 to 10,000. This is where we need to keep our accountability. This is what we need to help, is children like in that first screen who are spending their time away from families unnecessarily. And I'm the first to say some First Nations children should be in foster care, but not because their families are denied an opportunity to care for them that every other Canadian takes advantage of. That's what spurred me to file, along with the Assembly of First Nations, a human rights case against Canada. It was because of this long history of first steps and pats on the backs that never resulted in real substantive change for children. And as we all know, this case was going through 9 years it took to get to trial. That's a whole childhood. Some of you have had children that have been children and grown up in university. I know we saw a picture of a young boy, his name is Elliot, and his mom is here today. And he's about this high, well, he's about this high now. 9 years is a long time in the lives of a child. And the government was arguing to get it kicked out on legal technicalities, not on the basis of what's right for kids. When the tribunal finally rendered its judgment and we finally got the evidence in it, we saw documents like this showing the shortfall. These are secret documents. These are the federal government's own documents. And even their own expert report agreed with our calculation of the shortfall. They hired KPMG to try and discredit that report. It came within 0.025% of our calculations back in 2005. And yet, even with that knowledge, the federal government was fighting against these kids. This is another one. It shows the cross-cutting inequalities in education, social assistance, and basics like water and housing. Now, some people say, well, you can't expect for us to get clean water up to northern communities. It's too complicated. But somehow we got clean water and a Twitter feed up to a guy on a space station with no problem. One citizen. So why is it with the great resources of our country we can't get clean water and a good education up to children in northern Canada? The place where much of our wealth is drawn from the good people of the north. I think it's absolutely unacceptable. We cannot allow ourselves those types of excuses. And what you're seeing here is instead of going and covering the shortfalls that they know exist in child welfare from Treasury Board, they are actually shifting money away from other needed programs like fire protection. We all know the terrible stories of deaths from fire on reserve, the lack of water on reserve, the housing budget, building schools. That money was transferred over to cover these shortfalls, the equivalent of really shifting deck chairs on the Titanic. And to me, when you are discriminating across a whole array of programs, it's like, it kind of reminds me about if someone is in a lot of debt and you're paying one credit card off with another credit card. That's not the answer. The answer is to go and re-budget so that you make sure you're treating your citizens fairly across the country. It's not saying to First Nations people, you have to sacrifice so that we can do a lot of things that we want to do. And I want to think about this for a minute, because I hear this a lot, that, you know, we're doing a lot for First Nations kids, we're doing all these good things. But Canada, since the decision came out, where the panel showed us that today's discrimination is widening the disadvantage from residential school, not narrowing it. And they substantiated racial discrimination in 2016 happening against 163,000 kids and ordered it to stop. The tribunal has had to issue 2 compliance orders against the federal government to try to get it to stop, and it's still not stopping. So what are the kids losing to? What are the things that are more important for us to pay for in this country? Why should First Nations kids like the ones that you saw in that first PowerPoint slide be asked to stand on the sidelines while we pay for things like flagpoles and tennis courts, or even to rebuild this building? Why would we put a bunch of mortar and brick before the childhoods and our historic opportunity to set things right in one of the darkest chapters of Canadian history? The Prime Minister agrees we need to do better than kids, but it takes more than words to do that. And we cannot allow ourselves to continue to drink from the toxic potion of incremental equality. For 2 reasons. Children's childhoods are not incremental, and a second reason is it never comes. Remember that 1967 report? I'm gonna have my 52nd birthday on Friday. I'm still waiting, and my childhood is over. So we can't make the same mistake twice. And we don't need to make the same mistake twice. We're better than that as a people. This is more important than political parties. This is not a time to defend what your government did or did not do in the past. And it's certainly not a time to defend our collective inaction as citizens. As we have learned through the great leaders around the world, great leaders and great citizens lift their country up by its pain. We acknowledge the wrongdoing. We take down our Confederate flag, and we teach future generations so it will never fly in this country again. Because every child is worth the money. And every child is deserving of looking up and seeing adults who are leading this country into the future, standing with them and saying that you matter. As Shannon Kustachin said, school's a time for dreams, and every kid deserves this. Well, equality shouldn't just be for dreams for children, and they shouldn't have to spend their whole childhood doing it. And with your help, you can change that today. Let's make the 150th birthday celebration one for all First Nations kids, where they can truly stand with this country, and that we as a public will breathe life into that Lino Canada O Canada, we stand on guard for thee, and be able to sing it with pride, because we know that we have translated the value of fairness into something real for all of the children in the country. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Cindy, for what is always both an inspirational and an extraordinary challenge to Canadians. I've heard you now speak a few times, and it's only more and more powerful each time, so thank you. So we'll open up the floor to questions. Please use the microphone at the center of the room. Vous pouvez poser vos questions en anglais ou en français, selon votre préférence, but whichever language you use, please make your questions of an interrogatory nature. Thank you very much.
And while you make your way to the things, for those of you who want to learn more about Duncan Campbell Scott and the great Canadian Peter Henderson Bryce, there are actual final resting places over in Beechwood Cemetery. And there are historic plaques there that explain both of their legacies in Canadian history. So go and visit them.
Thank you.
Cindy, Laura Egerton from the Adoption Council of Canada. First to say, we stand with you.
Thank you.
And second to say, what can we do? As you say, there's half of the kids in care across Canada are Aboriginal. We know we need to work on prevention. It's a huge issue. Yeah. Many of those kids need to be in their communities. We also need to do something, and I'm interested in what you recommend, for the kids who are currently in care, many of them for years. And when they age out of care without families, many of them are committing suicide and ending up on the streets. Yeah. So what do we do for those kids currently in care now who need permanency?
Well, one of the things that we're looking at is, and have recommended, is we actually need community liaison workers to liaise with children in care so they do have ties to their culture, so they do have ties for their language. And we're working with my colleagues at the University of Alberta. We're about to produce a video. It'll be coming out probably in November. And it's called Displaced. And it's the stories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children who were in care and what recommendations they have for reform in the child welfare system. And what all of them have a message to say is, you can put us in different settings, but never separate us from who we are. Never separate us from who we are. And one of the findings of the tribunal is that we need band representatives funded by the federal government. They're statutory in many provinces. And those people are key to ensuring that those children remain connected to their culture and their languages. And so there are many things both in that Displaced video. We've also got the Touchstones of Hope, and we have an actual fact sheet on structural interventions that would keep children in their family homes to address things like poverty in a child welfare context, so we don't see as many kids going into care, and those in care actually go home safely.
At the back.
Hi there. Heather Sams from Shirk. It's probably a follow-up from her question, but our table would like to know we all leave here today and go back to our regular lifestyle, and we'd just like to know what we as citizens could do to help your cause.
Thank you. Well, one of the things that we were so overwhelmed with, certainly I was, is the caring nature of Canadians when they find out about this. So many of us just simply have grown up with the belief that First Nations people get a lot more. It's a question of the country's been too generous to First Nations, not the opposite. And so when people find out that that's not the case, they really do want to help. So on our website, fncaringsociety.com, that's F as a first, N as in nations, caringsociety.com, you're going to find 7 free ways to make a difference in under 2 minutes. And the reason we made them free is, I don't know about you, but probably many of you too in Ottawa get asked by various NGOs to make a donation, and that's important. That's one way to make a difference. But I absolutely believe in the ability of every citizen, regardless of income, to be a change agent and a co-creator in reconciliation. So nothing we do costs anything. Then you can find those 7 free ways on our website. And if you'd like to do more, you're going to see examples from children who are actually really leading this movement by creating change in their schools and in their communities.
Right here.
My name is Ruel Amder, and on this occasion, I'm covering this event for First Nations Drum. The question I have is related to the study on Indigenous and First Nations women that is now in process. The history of these kinds of inquiries has usually been to slow down what the government does rather than to speed it up. And I suspect that the results of this study is something that you could sit down and write on right now. I'm wondering what you think can be done to avoid the government using this as a way of delaying.
Thank you.
Okay. The other thing, by the way, I'll just pick up on that last question, is write your member of parliament and tell them that the top issue on their political agenda should be ending racial discrimination against children. And write to your media too, because they need to hear that from their constituents in order to be able to raise it in the House in an informed way. With regard to the question on the inquiry on murdered and missing Indigenous women, we do already have inquiries on the books on murdered and missing Indigenous women. And I think it's vital that Canada, as a collective in Parliament, I'm not just picking on the governing party, that we demonstrate our integrity to those women and to their families by acting meaningfully on the recommendations that are already on the books while the inquiry goes ahead. There's no reason to put everything on hold while we wait for the inquiry results, particularly with child welfare. Child welfare is one of the major issues identified by the women and their families as needing reform. Well, we have all these reports I talked about and 3 legal decisions by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ordering the federal government to stop racially discriminating against children, where they provide details about how that should be done. I think complying with those orders would go a long way to restoring faith in the process, and I hope that we can see that happen very soon. If not, we will continue to use any and all legal processes necessary to compel such a change, because the children are worth it.
We'll only have time for the 3 people who are currently standing, so we'll go to the back.
Hello, Kwe. My name is Teresa Trollope. I work at the Canadian Museum of History. I have the opportunity there to encourage people to learn some of the local languages around the country. And I've been privileged to be able, on top of English and French, to learn some Anishinaabemowin. Now, I saw you at receiving the Golden Whistleblower Award not too long ago. And while you were there, during your talk, you mentioned some harassment that you had experienced. I wonder if you could speak a little more about that.
I'll speak a little more about it, but I want to say that I am not the victim. It's the 163,000 children who have experienced the discrimination, or where I really want Parliament's attention to be on. But during the course of this, when the federal government was unsuccessful in getting the case kicked out on legal technicalities, they deployed 189 public servants, both in the Department of Justice and Aboriginal Affairs, and from their own documents, this number comes from. And from their own email transactions, we know that they were looking for other motives that I might have for having brought this case so it could be kicked out on frivolous and vexatious grounds. That to me was, of course, a personal violation, but it also violated the very premise of democracy. If the Canadian government had a case, they should have argued it in the courts. It's not fair to come after individual citizens who are standing up, or organizations, and try to dig up some kind of unforeseen motive. If there is such a motive, argue it in court. Don't deploy my tax dollars to find 189 public servants out there, because I think the kids could have really used that money and those public servants' energies much more than, and they didn't find anything, because there wasn't anything.
Yes.
A Plague on Humanity is a book by a Harvard professor, I'm sorry I forget his name, 1999 I think it was published, and it was about the use of biological warfare by Japan in China. The author mentions that The first use of biological warfare was by Sir Geoffrey Amherst when he authorized spreading smallpox by delivering infected blankets to Indian tribes. Remember that, weapon of mass destruction, biological warfare. Sir Geoffrey Amherst, his painting, his portrait is in the National Gallery, something like the Campbell you mentioned. The deaths of Indigenous people, women, and the residential schools have been characterized as a form of genocide. The question, would you say a genocidal policy against First Nations is in effect in Canada presently?
Yes. I believe it is, and it's in the purposeful and conscious separation of a generation of children unnecessarily. And the further piling on of their disadvantage in education, health, and basics like water. I don't know, it doesn't matter to me what you call it. It is just clearly indecent and unjust for a good country like ourselves. The important thing that you raised, though, is as we turned our attention to the United States last night in the debates, many people don't know that the United Nations, or the U.S. Declaration of Independence includes the words, the merciless Indian savages. That's in Article 2 of the Declaration of Independence. And that kind of relationship between Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, and the U.S. government echoed through a whole variety of their actions. In fact, Canadian residential schools are founded on a Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. And the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania was modeled after U.S. prisons. So that's where our history comes from, is that we have unfortunately imported many of these colonial ideas, and we in turn actually exported the whole Indian Act pass system and residential school system to the South Africans for apartheid, huh? Yeah.
Last question, thank you.
Cindy, thank you so much. You're a hero for our time, and just so appreciate your work and your voice. I'm Sheila Malcolmson. I'm Member of Parliament for Nanaimo Ladysmith and the New Democrat spokesperson for Status of Women. If the finance minister was able to implement, wanted to implement in the budget the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal rulings, what is the dollar amount that we're looking at? What, if you can describe the gap? Thanks.
At this point, we don't have all the data from the Department of Indian Affairs, but our best estimates based on the available data is that for this year alone, the budget gap is at least $155 million on child and family. And that does not take into account the lack of funding on Jordan's Principle. The federal government made an announcement on Jordan's Principle, which is a principle to ensure First Nations children can access services on the same terms as others. But we don't know what that looks like. And we're very concerned that the federal government is saying that Jordan's Principle only applies to children with disabilities and short-term illnesses. Now, I'm not sure, but my understanding of the Charter on Rights and Freedoms that says that you should get equal benefit under the law does not include the word disabilities and short-term illnesses. And so we need to encourage a broadening of that definition. Parliament passed Motion 296 in support of Jordan's Principle in December of 2007. And it's a very basic principle. It means that First Nations children can access government services on the same terms as others. So any narrowing of it is, in my view, discriminatory and is, in my view, discriminatory. And I think the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders make that pretty clear as well.
Well, thank you all for your questions, and please join me once again in saying a real thank you, and more than a thank you, a deep appreciation of the challenge that you are giving to each and every one of us. I was so struck by Cindy's phrase that we should not be drinking the toxic potion of incremental equality because it never comes. I think that's what I am going to take away amongst many other important things that you've said today. Cindy, you are just doing a remarkable job, and I hope that many of us here will be able to stand with you and celebrate on the 150th as you suggest.
Me too,
Thank you,
I'll
Cindy.
even bake the cake.
I have a very small token of thanks to Cindy. Now, she doesn't live in Vancouver anymore, so I'm not sure why we're giving you an umbrella, but nonetheless, here it is. Je voudrais remercier encore une fois le CRSH pour leur soutien précieux tout au long de cette série. Merci encore à l'honorable Greg Fergus, notre député parrain de la série de causeries voire grandes. Thank you all for joining us, and I want to note that Cindy's presentation and conversation will be on video on the Federation website shortly. I hope that you're going to join us, all of you, for our next Big Thinking lecture on October 25th. Write that down. This event will be a presentation entitled The 2016 U.S. Election, How Did It Come to This, and Where Is It Going? Registration is open, and our speaker will be one of the true global experts on American politics, Canada Research Chair in Public Opinion, Elections and Representation at the University of British Columbia, Dr. Richard Johnson, Dick Johnson. He's fabulous. Come and hear him. I hope to see you there. And as you leave, please pick up the flyer at the registration desk featuring the next 2 Big Thinking on the Hill speakers, as well as 2 Big Thinking on the Road speakers, one in Toronto on November 9th and another in Kingston on November 19th. Merci encore et bonne journée à tous. Thank you and have a great day.